Greetings, fellow Hebrew travelers. Here's a quick review of imperfect verbs. Just to review where we are in the verbal system. So we've talked quite a bit now about perfect verbs, which is the third category down. Now we're going to move up and talk about imperfect verbs. So in one sense, the imperfect is the most common in that almost every vowel pattern or every verb pattern has an imperfect form. And so it's good to know what those look like. Also, you'll find out a little bit later that once you learn the imperfect, it provides you a lot of other information about some of the other forms. But for right now, we're going to concentrate on the call imperfect, and we'll talk just briefly about the PL and the Hifil imperfect. So first, let's talk about the form of imperfect verbs. So all imperfect verbs of whatever verbal pattern indicate person, number, and gender through the use of prefixes. So they all have prefixes, or they use prefixes and suffixes. So sometimes there will be a suffix, but there doesn't necessarily need to be, but there will always be a prefix. And by prefix, we mean a Hebrew letter that will precede the root. So all verbal patterns use the same prefixes or prefixes and suffixes. So there's only one set of prefixes and suffixes to learn for the imperfect, just like there was only one set of suffixes for the perfect. And thus sometimes the imperfect form is also called the prefixed form. So you might see that terminology somewhere. So what are the prefixes? So the third masculine singular form, the prefix is yod. So I've chosen the root here, shin, mem, ayin, shama, which means to hear or to hear and obey. So this would be he or it will hear. And most perfect forms, probably the default translation value for perfect is future tense. So he will hear, yishma, looks like this. So just think of the yod as the prefix for a third masculine singular form. So I think overall in the Hebrew Bible there are about 16,000 imperfect verbs of whatever verbal pattern, and of those 16,000, I think 5 or 6,000, so maybe a good third of them are the third masculine singular form. So if you can remember the yod prefix, you have a lot of your work done for you. Here's what the third masculine plural looks like, yishma'u. And notice that basically the verb goes from singular to plural by adding a shurik vowel and u vowel at the end of the verb. So in this case, there's both a prefix and a suffix. The second person masculine singular, tishma, is you masculine. So that verb form has a tav as a prefix. The second person y'all form, for y'all masculine form, is tishma'u. So just like yishma'u was plural for the masculine, so tishma'u is plural for the masculine you form, the second masculine plural. So they both go from singular to plural by adding an u vowel at the end. So there's also a second person feminine singular, you feminine, which is tishma'i. So it provides or gets its femininity by a combination of a tav and at the beginning and a yod at the end. Then we have a special form for second person feminine plural, so y'all feminine, which of course doesn't occur very often because for a group to be considered feminine, it must be all feminine. So that is tishmana. So it has both a ta prefix and a na suffix. Then we have a third person feminine singular, she or it. So that's tishma. We have a third person feminine plural, they feminine, which is tishmana. Maybe that sounds familiar. We have a first person common singular I form, so I will here is eshma. So that's pretty unique in the language, I think, in terms of a aleph prefix, so it sort of stands out. And then the first person common plural is a nun prefix, so it's nishma, we. So those are the prefixes / prefixes and suffix combinations of the imperfect. Again, all verbal patterns use this same set of prefixes / prefixes, suffixes. Now, be aware that there is some potential for confusion. So notice that the second person masculine singular, the you masculine form tishma, is exactly the same as third person feminine singular tishma. So you will hear and she will hear is written in the same way. Even though you might think this would cause a lot of confusion when you're reading a text, I would say it's almost always apparent whether it should be you or she, just from the context of what's going on. So this looks to us like this is just crazy, and why couldn't they come up with a different combination? But they didn't, and it apparently didn't cause problems for them, for the Israelites, and it doesn't really cause too much of a problem for us. We also have another set of forms that are the same. So the tishmana is the same both for the second feminine plural and for the third feminine plural. So yal feminine or they feminine. So the yal feminine, at least in the Hebrew Bible, only occurs 16 times. So the chances of you running across that are probably fairly remote. And although the form occurs a few more times in the they form, it's also not particularly common. So once again, usually context provides us all we need to know as to which of those two forms work for us. So how do we parse the imperfect? So we first provide the verbal pattern, then the type of verb, then the person, number, and gender, and then the root, just like we're used to from call, or from the perfect verb, excuse me. So this is call imperfect, third masculine plural, from the root pay, kov dalet. So same format for parsing. If you parse a verb on your translation project and you don't necessarily follow this order, that's okay, but just know that when people ask you to parse a verb, they probably want this order. A few words about the translation value of the imperfect. Again, the default for the imperfect is the future tense. So if you don't have any other information leading you any other direction, perfect tense is probably where you need to go. Excuse me, future tense. There's also the possibility for what Seau and others call the modal tense. So instead of he will hear, it could be also translated he could hear, he would hear, he should hear, he may hear, he might hear. So all of these are translation possibilities. And the would, I think, possibility deserves maybe a little bit of special attention. So if you're used to, if you've taken Greek and you think back to the imperfect tense in Greek, the imperfect tense is continuous action in the past, so things like he used to take a walk to the beach every morning. Um, so, in that sense, the would possibility could function um, in the same way in biblical Hebrew. So, this is just sort of one little slight, tiny overlap where imperfect in biblical Hebrew overlaps with imperfect in Greek. So, you could say something like, uh, when the king was alive, he uh, would get up in the morning and take a walk to the beach every day. So that sort of sense of would, which is an event that happened continuously in the past, could be expressed in the same way in biblical Hebrew. But again, your default, your go to tense should be future tense. But do keep these other possibilities in mind because they might add some special nuance to your translation that you're looking for. Now let's look just briefly about the imperfect in some other verbal patterns. So we talked about this a bit in class, but I think they're worth going over. So how do you tell the difference between a call imperfect, a PL imperfect, and a HIFIL imperfect? And this is where that chart that I've handed out in class comes in handy. And you should take some time to just kind of compare the columns and see if you can glom onto some specific differences that help you parse these verbs. So in the call, the prefix is, in a strong verb at least, is pointed, or the vowel marking is a y vowel. So it's a heroic vowel with the prefix. So that's one particular element. Also, and you don't see it here in this verb because the third root letter is a guttural, but usually you have an O vowel. If you look at your chart, an O vowel over the second root letter in the call. So that's can be, in most of the forms, another clue. In PL, instead of y, we have y, so we have a schwa under the prefix, so that's helpful for us. And in HIFIL, instead of ye or ya, we have ya, so a patach under the prefix is very typical for strong rooted verbs. Another feature of the PL is that, just like in the perfect form, if the middle root letter can take a dagesh, we would see it also in the imperfect. So in yedaber, we have this, once again, this dagesh in the middle root letter, so that's helpful for us. And in the hifil, we have a yod separating the second and third root letters in the imperfect. And if you look over your chart, you'll see that that is, unlike the perfect where it sort of comes and goes, it's very, very regular in the hifil. So that's a big clue of hifilality, I guess. So thanks for listening to this brief review of imperfect verbs. I'm sure you will encounter some in your translation project. Let me know if you have questions. Thanks a lot.